Before we begin, welcome to No Name, a place where the quiet roads, the lonely campgrounds, and the forgotten corners of America reveal the stories most travelers never speak aloud. If you love true RV horror, strange encounters, and those unsettling moments that stay with you long after the engine shuts off, you're in the right place. As you listen tonight, if the story pulls you in, if it makes you pause before your next trip into the dark, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your own experiences in the comments. Every story you tell helps this community grow, and you never know. Your encounter might become the next voice whispered into the night. Now, settle in. This one is called Something Tapped on the Slide Out, a chilling encounter at Colorado's Red Feather Lakes, September 2023. I've learned something about fear, real fear, out there on the road. It doesn't announce itself. It whispers softly from the edges of the dark like a memory you didn't know you still carried. And sometimes it taps just once on the thin wall of your RV, reminding you that the wilderness is never as empty as it looks. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 41 years old, and I've been RV camping across the western U.S. for the better part of a decade. I've weathered storms, mechanical breakdowns, strange neighbors, injured wildlife, even a runaway wildfire evacuation in Nevada. But nothing has followed me in my dreams the way the night at Red Feather Lakes, Colorado still does. I went there in September 2023, partly because the summer crowds were thinning, and partly because the place had a reputation among longtime campers. Peaceful, quiet, tucked into the pines at the edge of the Roosevelt National Forest. People called it a reset button spot, somewhere you could breathe again. And I needed that. I'd been dealing with months of tension after my father's passing, running from campsite convinced that constant movement was better than sitting still with my own thoughts. Stillness had begun to feel dangerous. So I drove into Red Feather Lakes on a Thursday afternoon with the intention of finally grounding myself, of letting silence settle around me long enough to hear whatever I'd been avoiding inside myself. I didn't know how aggressively that silence was going to answer back. I parked my Volkswagen-based RV conversion, a rig I'd built with my own hands, white paneling, cedar trim, compact slide out on the passenger side, a home that felt like mine in a way no apartment ever had. I found a spot by the water, with tall pines lifting against a sky that smelled like late autumn and wood smoke drifting from distant fire rings. The lake was so still it reflected the tree line like polished black glass. I remember thinking, this is the first place in months where nothing feels wrong. But that's the trap of quiet places. They let the smallest disturbance feel enormous. That first night, the forest breathed with a slow, living rhythm. Crickets, distant owls, the crackle of dying campfires from campers I couldn't see. I sat beneath my awning, letting the cold settle into my lungs. It was a rare, good kind of cold, clean, grounding. But even then, I sensed something else. A tension in the air, like the woods were watching me rather than welcoming me. I brushed it off as anxiety surfacing now that I'd stopped running. I told myself I was overthinking the stillness because I wasn't used to peace anymore. Inside the RV, I made tea and read until the words blurred. Around 1:17 a.m., I finally killed the lights and slipped into bed. A soft breeze brushed the slide-out wall, the one right beside my head. I always sleep with my face to that side because it feels safer than facing the open space of the RV. I didn't realize how exposed that made me. At first, it was nothing, just wind touching the metal, a tree creaking, a faraway splash on the lake. Then the wind stopped, and the splash stopped, and everything went still. I opened my eyes in the dark, that heavy, suffocating dark you only find where there are no streetlights, no towns, no hum of distant highways, only starlight filtered through pine branches. I held my breath, listening. Silence isn't just absence of sound. Silence is pressure. Silence is intention. And then, lightly, so lightly, I questioned whether I even heard it. Tap, right against the slide-out wall, a single precise tap, not like a pine cone falling, not like a branch brushing, more like a finger, testing the boundary. My pulse snapped awake, I didn't sit up. I didn't move. The darkness felt like it was leaning in, waiting to see what I'd do next. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe sap dripping, maybe a beetle hitting metal, maybe my imagination finally having room to breathe after months of running. 10 minutes passed. My heartbeat slowed. And then tap, tap, two this time, and timed. Purposeful. I felt a cold roll down my spine, so deep it hit my stomach. It wasn't the taps themselves, it was the silence between them. Too long, too deliberate, like something was thinking. I reached slowly for the flashlight beside my bed. Before I could turn it on, scrape! Something dragged across the slide-out wall, slow as a nail tracing a message. The sound vibrated through the thin metal just inches from my skull. I shot upright, adrenaline exploding through me. I whipped on the flashlight and aimed it at the window over the bed. The beam hit condensation and darkness beyond. Nothing but my own breath fogging the glass. I waited, knuckles white around the flashlight. No more taps, no more scraping, just the forest, silent, holding its breath right along with me. I stayed like that until the sky paled, until the first gray wisps of dawn finally broke the night apart. Only then did I open the door and step outside, half expecting to see claw marks or footprints or some sign of whoever or whatever had been there. The siding was smooth, completely untouched. But the ground told a different story. Pine needles were disturbed in a narrow trail around the perimeter of the RV, like someone had walked slow circles in the dark. I crouched and followed the marks, noticing places where a heel had pressed deep, then lighter scuffs where something pivoted or stood still. The tracks circled all the way around my RV, twice. But what bothered me most wasn't the tracks, it was the spacing between them, too close together for a normal stride, too heavy for a child, too deliberate for wildlife. Something had crept around me in the night, and it wanted me to know it. I should have packed up, I should have left. But fear does strange things. It makes you rationalize, makes you insist that the impossible has an explanation. And I'd spent months refusing to sit with my own inner turmoil. Leaving now would feel like running again. I stayed. I told myself I needed one more night to reclaim the peace I'd come here for. But as the sun set again over Red Feather Lakes, something inside me tightened. The air grew colder. Not the normal alpine chill, but something sharper, like an inhale before a scream. By midnight, the lakeside campground felt abandoned, swallowed by darkness. I kept every interior light off. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I shouldn't call attention to myself. Around 12:43 a.m., the woods began to shift. Not with sound, but with presence. It's like when someone enters a room behind you and you just know without hearing them. The hairs on my arms rose, my breathing went shallow, and then tap, soft, almost polite. This time directly against the bedroom window. I froze, blood pounding so loudly I could feel it in my teeth. The tap came again, 2 beats, gentle, measured. I knew better than to look, but fear overruled reason. Slowly, so slowly, I turned my head toward the window, flashlight in my shaking hand. A shadow moved across the glass, not a reflection, not a branch, a shape, tall, lean. So close its body heat, or something like heat, fogged part of the glass from the outside. I aimed the flashlight, and in that split second, I saw, not a face, but the outline of one, nose nearly touching the window, eyes I couldn't fully make out, a humanoid shape, too still, too vertical, too focused on the exact point where my head had been resting minutes earlier. The beam of my flashlight hit the glass, and the shadow moved. Fast. It darted out of the light like a spider exposed under a turned stone. I lunged backward, heart crashing in my chest, fumbling for the keys. I didn't care about the time, the darkness, the danger of driving out of a forest campground at night. I just knew I wasn't staying another minute. I turned the ignition. The engine cranked, failed, cranked again, failed. My breath hitched. I slammed a hand against the dash. The third time, the engine roared to life. I threw the RV into drive just as something hit the slide-out wall. Not a tap this time, but a full, heavy shove, enough to rock the entire vehicle. I floored it. Branches scraped the sides. Gravel spat from under the tires. My headlights punched through the pitch-black trees as I barreled toward the exit road. But in the driver's side mirror, I saw it. For a moment that froze every muscle in my body. A figure standing in the middle of the road behind me. Tall, motionless, watching. No light reflected from its eyes. No features were clear. Just a silhouette that stayed perfectly centered in the mirror, even as the vehicle shook over washboard gravel. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I kept driving until the road widened and the trees finally broke open into the empty two-lane highway leading away from the lakes. Only then did the figure disappear. I didn't stop driving until Fort Collins. Even then, I slept in a Walmart parking lot with every light on, keys in hand, doors locked twice. Days later, after the fear settled into something almost manageable, I tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe it was a local bored enough to stalk a lone camper. Maybe I projected grief and anxiety onto the shadows. But the taps, their timing, the scrape, the shape outside the glass, the sheer unnatural stillness, I can't explain those. And here's what I learned that night. Something I didn't understand until long after the panic faded. Sometimes the wilderness mirrors what you bring into it. I walked into Red Feather Lakes carrying silence I didn't want to face, grief I hadn't processed, fear I pretended wasn't mine. And in that depth of silence, the forest spoke back, whether through something natural, something human, or something that moved in ways I still can't understand. But the lesson wasn't to run. The lesson was to listen, to trust the instinct that tightens your spine, to acknowledge the dread before it becomes a threat pressing its face against the thin wall beside your head, to respect the places where quiet turns into warning, and to remember that the thin metal of an RV is both a shelter and a reminder of how exposed we really are when the dark decides to pay attention. I still travel, I still camp, but when the night goes still, unnaturally still, I listen, I move, I leave. Because once you hear that first tap on the slide out, you never forget the possibility that something is tapping back. I still remember the night I learned that silence can be louder than any scream. It was the kind of silence that presses against your skin, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat, as if it's trying to warn you before anyone else can. My name is Riley Carter. I'm 39 years old, and in June of 2021, I took my old Volkswagen Eurovan out to Dead Horse Ranch State Park in Cottonwood, Arizona, hoping for nothing more than a quiet night under the desert sky. I wanted space, air, time to breathe away from people and the noise of my life. But what I found instead was something that began with quiet unease and grew into the kind of fear that digs roots into your memory and refuses to leave. I'd been RV camping most of my adult life, always with a deep respect for the land, for the weather, for the wildlife. But people were the thing I trusted least, and I guess that mistrust had been growing inside me long before that summer. Something about isolation always sharpened that edge. I used to tell myself I liked being alone. Maybe I believed it. But looking back now, I think I went out there to figure out whether solitude would finally heal me or reveal what I'd been avoiding. Dead Horse Ranch wasn't remote, not compared to the deep desert or the high plateaus miles off pavement, but at night it felt far from anything familiar. The Verd River cuts through cottonwood trees that move like restless shapes when the wind drags across them. Coyotes call in a way that carries too human a tone, and the heat, God, the heat, sits on your skin like a warning you can't interpret. I pulled into my reserved campsite close to dusk, the sky fading to a bruised lavender behind the cliffs. The campground had maybe 15 or 16 rigs scattered around, but none were close enough to make me feel watched or crowded. I remember stepping out of the van and taking a long inhale of the air, dry, warm, smelling faintly of creosote and river mud. It grounded me. For a moment, I felt like the old version of myself, the one who camped without imagining worst-case scenarios, the one who believed nature was neutral and people were mostly good. But even then, before anything strange happened, something felt off. Nothing you could point to. Nothing obvious. Just a small tension, like the desert was holding its breath. I chalked it up to being tired from the drive and spent the evening settling in. I cooked, I journaled, I listened to the low rustle of the riverbank not far away. The sun dropped and the temperature softened into something almost pleasant. I stayed outside until the stars came out, brighter than they ever appear in the city. When I finally climbed into my van to sleep, I left the windows cracked for airflow and let the night sounds drift through the darkness. That's when the unease returned, subtle but real. A sensation like someone was standing just outside the radius of the van's windows, watching. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing out of place. Just that cold instinct that always arrives first before the mind can make sense of anything. I tried to brush it off. Fear without evidence, I told myself, is just imagination rehearsing for danger. But rehearsal turned into performance faster than I expected. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up to the first sound, a slow, dragging crunch of gravel. Not a shuffle, not an animal, but a deliberate step, followed by another, and another. Someone was walking past my campsite. I lifted my head, listening, waiting to hear the voice of a late-night camper or the distant glow of a flashlight. Nothing came. The steps stopped somewhere near the back of my van. My breathing tightened as I lay completely still, straining my ears. Then, 2 soft taps against the metal. Knuckles. No question. Knock. And then, after several seconds, knock. My throat dried instantly. Nobody knocks on an RV window in the middle of the night unless something is wrong. Or unless they are what's wrong. I forced myself to call out, my voice barely steady. Hello? Everything okay? No response, just the wind brushing against the cottonwoods. I sat up slowly, trying not to make noise, and reached for the long flashlight I kept beside the bed. I thought about turning on a light, but every instinct screamed against it. I didn't want whoever was out there to know exactly where in the van I was sitting. Another sound, this time softer, but unmistakable, breathing. Not mine. Not an animal. Human. It came from the driver's side door. Slow, controlled, almost thoughtful, like the person outside wasn't out of breath, wasn't nervous, just waiting for me to do something. My pulse climbed until I could feel it in my palms. I leaned forward and eased one eye toward the window, trying to stay hidden in the shadow of the curtains. I couldn't see much, just the faint glow of a campsite lamp from 2 sites down reflecting off the pale dust of the parking pad. But then, movement. A shape stepped out of the darkness just far enough that the dim light caught the side of a face. A man, tall, thin, wearing something that looked like a dark jacket or hoodie despite the warmth. His head tilted slightly, listening. He was listening to me. My heart dropped into my stomach. My first instinct was to start the van, turn the headlights on, flood him with light, scare him off, but I hesitated. If he was armed, if he panicked, that instant could go very wrong. Instead, I gripped the flashlight like a weapon and waited. The man took one slow step toward the window. Not fast, not testing. Just approaching, like I was something he'd already decided belonged to him. I whispered to myself, do something. But fear pinned me perfectly still. He reached the edge of the van's door. I saw only the faint outline of his face now, but it was enough to see the expression, or lack of one. No anger, no fear, no urgency. Just a blank calmness that made him infinitely more unsettling. Then he leaned in closer. His voice was almost gentle. You alone in there? A cold shock traveled down my spine. The question was wrong, too direct, too casual. Like he wasn't asking out of concern, but out of confirmation. I swallowed hard. I tried to sound confident, louder than I felt. I'm fine. Leave my sight. A long stretch of silence. I could hear the wind again, the subtle quiver of canvas from a tent farther down the loop. Then he said something that tightened every muscle in my body. You shouldn't keep your windows open. My breath stopped. He had been watching me before I fell asleep. My hand hovered over the van keys, but before I could move, the man turned away. Slowly, like he had all the time in the world. He took several steps back into the shadows near the trees. his figure dissolving into the dark until I couldn't see him anymore. But I could feel him, somewhere out there, still facing the van. I closed the windows immediately, locked the doors, and sat frozen, listening to nothing but the pounding of my pulse. I knew I should call someone, park rangers, anyone, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The phone screen glowed too brightly in the darkness, and I kept thinking he might see it, might realize I was trying to reach for help. Minutes passed. Then maybe more. Time stretched in a way I've never felt before. Thin, fragile, about to snap. That's when I realized something was different. A sound I hadn't heard earlier. Breathing. Again. But this time, not outside. It was faint, muffled, coming from the rear of the van. Not loud enough to be normal, not close enough to be my own reflection in the metal. A chill rolled across my chest. The back cargo door, the one I wasn't sure I had fully latched earlier. The one that sometimes stuck unless slammed shut. I turned, staring into the dim interior of the van. Everything looked normal. Just storage bins, blankets, gear. Nothing out of place, but the breathing continued, barely perceptible but rhythmic. Human, inside or right against the rear door. I didn't know which was worse. My body tensed, ready to move, but the fear held me in place for one more second. One heartbeat too long. And then, something pressed against the back door from the outside. A push. Firm. Testing. I stifled a gasp, gripping the flashlight tighter. Another push followed, harder this time, making the frame of the door tremble. And then a voice. But not the man from earlier. A whisper, female, low, urgent. Don't open. He's still here. My blood ran cold. I didn't move. Couldn't. I leaned forward, straining to hear, my breath caught in my throat. The whisper came again, barely cutting through the metal. Please, don't open. He's waiting. My mind raced. Was she with him? Was she hurt? Was this some kind of setup? Or was she trying to warn me? The door shifted, not violently, just enough for me to see the top of the rubber gasket quiver. She whispered once more, this time closer, almost directly against the metal. He's not alone. My chest tightened so sharply I almost doubled over. That was when the first set of footsteps returned, slow, methodical, approaching the front of the van again, and someone else with him. The footsteps stopped just out of view of the front windows, and the faint scrape of gravel under boots made my stomach knot tighter. I wanted to scream, to throw open the doors and run into the night, but something anchored me in place. My eyes darted around the van interior, flashlight in hand, heart hammering, thinking, planning, hoping I'd find a way out before he even noticed my hesitation. Then a shadow appeared in the corner of my vision. The woman from before. Her face pale, eyes wide, silent, except for the urgent glance that begged me to trust her. Somehow her presence made the tension heavier, made it more real. I realized she wasn't part of this in the way I expected. She wasn't a threat. She was evidence, witness, warning. I didn't understand why she was there, only that I had to make a choice, move or freeze and let them decide my fate. I moved, slow, deliberate, each step measured as if the van itself might betray me with a squeak. I edged toward the side door, hand on the latch. Behind me, the woman's whisper was gone, but the sense of being watched intensified. My breath came faster now, not just from fear, but from a deep, instinctive awareness that whatever had come to my sight that night wasn't just random. It had been waiting. The man's shadow appeared again, this time closer to the driver's window, illuminated just enough by the pale glow of distant campsite lamps. His face was sharp in that light, calm, predatory, like he knew my every thought before I could think it. And that's when I understood. I was being tested. Every instinct I'd ever had about danger, every anxious caution I'd learned through years of camping alone, was about to be proven right or wrong. I fumbled with the door handle, and in that instant, his head snapped in my direction. The calmness left his features, replaced by a slow, deliberate focus. He moved toward the van. I jerked the door open and, without thinking, bolted. Adrenaline propelled me into the cool night, across the uneven desert gravel, the woman falling in behind me. My legs burned, my lungs burned, but terror made each stride feel limitless. Behind me, the crunch of boots on gravel escalated, multiplied, as if the darkness itself had joined in pursuit. I reached the main road, the little ribbon of asphalt that led out of the campground, and threw my hands up, waving at the dim light of a distant security patrol truck. The men stopped, shouting, and I ran into their headlights. Relief hit me like a physical force when they jumped out, calling for me to slow down. I gasped the story between shudders, the woman staying close, silent but alive, watching. The police, the rangers, the flashing lights, all of it turned what had been invisible into something concrete. Evidence collected, footprints, tire marks, the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering around my van. The man had disappeared into the desert night, just like a shadow evaporating in dawn's early light. But the fear, the knowledge that he had been so close, so deliberate, it didn't leave. I learned then that trust in the wilderness or in life is a fragile thing. My instincts had saved me. Fear, that raw, unrelenting sensation I had tried to ignore earlier, had been my ally. And the woman, I never learned her name. She disappeared as quietly as she had appeared, leaving behind only the echo of her warning, her courage, her silent insistence that I survive. In the days that followed, I sat by the Verde River, staring at the cottonwoods, the sun rising and falling across the red cliffs, and I reflected. I realized that camping, the kind I had always sought for solace, was never just about escaping the world. It was about confronting it in its rawest form. The unpredictable, the dangerous, the human and inhuman elements mingled together. That night at Dead Horse Ranch taught me that fear isn't weakness. Fear is memory. Fear is preparation. Fear is a compass pointing to survival if you are willing to listen. I still take my Volkswagen out on solo trips, still watch for shadows where they don't belong, still keep the doors locked until the sun is high. But something changed inside me after that night. Something sharpened, something steady. I no longer see the forest, the desert, the river as just landscapes. I see them as active participants, each element a character, sometimes antagonistic, sometimes protective, sometimes indifferent, but always alive. And when I tell this story now, I tell it not to scare, not to dramatize, but to remind. There is a line between comfort and vigilance, between solitude and isolation. Respect that line. Listen to the wind, to the trees, to the whispers that brush past your consciousness. Your fear will guide you if you honor it. That night, under Arizona's desert stars, I learned that the greatest threat isn't always visible, but that the instinct to survive, when fueled by awareness and courage, can be sharper than the darkness itself. I drove away from Dead Horse Ranch the next morning, the sun painting the cliffs in gold and crimson, the desert already warm and alive. Behind me, the campsite looked peaceful, harmless even, but I knew what had happened there. I knew that somewhere beyond the trees the stranger still waited, and I also knew that I carried with me a kind of knowledge that cannot be taken away, the knowledge that fear, when embraced, can be a shield, that vigilance can be survival, that sometimes you need to run toward the unknown with every nerve screaming because the alternative is far worse. The Volkswagen hummed over the asphalt, steady, reliable, a sanctuary on wheels. And as I drove through the twisting roads of the Verde Valley, I realized I was carrying more than just gear and maps. I was carrying a story, a lesson, a warning, a reminder. That nights are long, shadows are deep, and strangers sometimes come out from the darkness. But if you trust your instincts, if you respect the warning signs, if you move with deliberate care, you can survive them. You can come back whole, alive, with your mind intact. And you can tell the story to others so they know that the wilderness is not just a place, it's a mirror. And sometimes it reflects what you need to see most. That night at Dead Horse Ranch didn't just scare me, it transformed me. The fear didn't leave, it became part of me, an internal compass guiding every future journey. And every time I roll into a new campsite, I hear the faint echo of those footsteps, the whisper in the wind, the reminder that I am alive because I listened when it mattered most. I never thought the forest could talk. Not really. Not in the way it did that October night in northern Michigan. My name is Lucas. I'm 34, and I've spent more weekends on the road than I can count, sliding my small Volkswagen camper through back roads and gravel tracks in search of quiet, solitude, and the kind of freedom that only a small RV and miles of untouched woods can provide. My wife, Emma, had been reluctant at first, worried about what could go wrong, but she trusted me, trusted that I would always know when to steer us back to safety. That trust, I realized too late, is both a blessing and a curse. We'd arrived at Whispering Pines Campground just as the sun was dipping behind the dense northern horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds. The place was almost empty, a handful of other campers scattered across the massive, leaf-strewn sites. Pines stood like ancient sentinels, blackened shadows stretching across the dirt roads, swaying and creaking in a wind that felt colder than it should have been. Something about the way the forest seemed to press in on our little campsite unsettled me immediately. But I shrugged it off, telling myself that these were just my nerves, always wound too tight when the roads narrow and the trees grow tall. Setting up the VW was simple. Emma unpacked quietly while I leveled the camper and checked the propane. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth, the kind of smell that sinks into your lungs and refuses to leave. I remember noticing it lingering, heavy, almost clinging to me, and I felt a small shiver, not entirely from the chill. Dinner was quiet. Emma hummed softly as she stirred soup over our portable stove. The sounds of the forest outside were normal at first. The occasional caw of a raven, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant echo of wind in the treetops. I had barely finished the first sip of coffee when I heard it. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind slipping through the broken branches, making the trees groan. But then I heard it again, a whisper, barely audible, so faint that I thought I imagined it. Lucas. I froze, the spoon suspended midair. Emma didn't seem to hear it, humming still, but my chest tightened. I set the cup down, listened harder. The whisper came again, closer this time, more insistent. Not a voice in my head, not a trick of my mind. A real voice, soft, human, but fractured somehow, like it was carried through the wind itself. I told myself it must be someone else camping nearby. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, sweeping it across the darkened trees, the narrow paths between the pines. Nothing. The other sites were empty, or at least completely dark. I heard the whisper again, and this time, unmistakably clear. Lucas, don't sleep. My stomach dropped. Rationally, I knew there was no one there. But the forest felt alive in a way that night that went beyond the usual creaks and sighs of pines. It felt aware, watching, waiting. I turned back to the camper to reassure Emma, but as I stepped on the leaf-strewn ground, I realized something. Every sound I'd dismissed, the snapping twigs, the rustling leaves, was synchronized to my movements. The forest was breathing with me. I shook my head, trying to force logic back into my mind. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the road, the stress of driving through narrow, twisting highways for days was finally catching up with me. But even as I told myself that, the whisper came again, louder, almost right behind me, carried on a wind that didn't exist. Lucas, you shouldn't be here. I spun, flashlight slicing through the darkness, heart hammering. The beam landed on a cluster of pines, and for a split second I thought I saw a figure, pale and still, staring at me from between the trunks. My rational mind screamed it was just the moonlight, shadows playing tricks. But the visceral pull of fear rooted me in place. I could feel my pulse in my ears, blood thundering, every instinct screaming to run, but I couldn't leave Emma, couldn't abandon her in the camper. Returning inside, I tried to mask my anxiety. Emma looked up, smiling softly, oblivious to the tension coiling in my chest. "You're imagining things," she said, reaching for my hand. I wanted to believe her. I needed to. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was circling us, just beyond the edge of the light. Night deepened. The camper's small heater hummed, trying and failing to warm the chill that seeped through the floorboards. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers returned, sometimes overlapping, almost conversational. At first, I thought I imagined them, fragments of sentences, fractured words. Then came the clarity, the unmistakable human cadence, layering over the forest's natural sounds. "Lucas, why did you come here?" I tried to convince myself it was a prank, a local trying to scare late-season campers. But that theory fell apart the moment I heard Emma stir beside me. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, voice trembling. She hadn't been sleeping, either. I took a deep breath, willing calm over fear. "It's probably just the wind," I said. "Just the wind, nothing else." But the voice didn't stop. Not outside, not inside. And that was the moment I realized the forest wasn't just whispering, it was learning. Each whisper seemed tailored, probing. Sometimes calling my name, sometimes asking questions I didn't want to answer, sometimes reminding me of things I had tried to forget. And every time I tried to ignore it, the whispers grew sharper, more insistent, pressing closer to the thin walls of our camper. By midnight, sleep was impossible. I sat on the edge of the bed, flashlight clutched in one hand, phone in the other. No signal, no other campers, just the forest, breathing and whispering, waiting. And then came the knocks. First, subtle, a soft rap at the side of the camper. I froze, listening. The sound came again, quicker, more deliberate. Someone or something was there. I wanted to tell Emma to stay calm, to trust me, but I couldn't speak. My throat felt raw, as though the forest itself had swallowed my voice. I edged toward the door, listening to the sequence of knocks, each one perfectly timed, echoing in the hollow night. The air smelled suddenly foul, not like pine anymore, but something damp and metallic like wet iron and decay. My stomach turned. I wanted to run, but running without Emma was impossible. Then, almost imperceptibly, I heard her voice, not Emma's, but the whispering voice mimicking her, soft, coaxing. "Come outside, come to us." My blood ran cold. The whispers had learned my weakness, fear for Emma. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The forest hit me in full force, cold, suffocating, alive. Shadows twisted around trunks, shadows that shouldn't exist. The wind carried fragmented voices, a chorus of whispering, chanting almost. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't see anything, and yet I felt them there, circling, watching, testing. I grabbed Emma's hand, dragging her back inside, locking the door. She clung to me, shivering. "Lucas, it's outside," she stammered. Her words confirmed what I already feared. Whatever this was, it was intelligent, intentional, and we were not welcome. Hours passed like minutes. The whispers never stopped, and the forest itself seemed to breathe in time with our fear. I remembered every piece of advice I had ignored over the years. Always trust your instincts. Never underestimate the loneliness of an empty campground. Respect the unknown. And now, faced with the full weight of that ignorance, I understood. Fear isn't just an emotion, it's a signal, a warning we often rationalize until it's almost too late. By the first pale hints of dawn, the forest began to retreat, shadows shrinking back, whispers fading into the wind. I emerged from the camper cautiously, checking every corner, every shadowed grove. Nothing. No sign of anyone, or anything. Only the smell of pine and damp earth, the normal sounds of a forest waking. But something had changed. The air felt heavier. The silence, stranger. I don't know what we experienced that night. A prank? A local legend come to life? Something else entirely? All I know is that the forest had spoken and we had listened. And in that listening, we had survived. But the fear didn't leave. It clung to me, like the pine scent that had refused to leave my clothes, my hair, my skin. It taught me something vital. Freedom on the road is intoxicating, yes, but it comes with responsibility. To listen, to respect, to honor the unknown. Even now, months later, I can hear it sometimes, soft, almost teasing. Whispers carried on the wind when I drive alone, when the night is deep and the road stretches endlessly. I remind myself I am safe. Remind myself it was only a night, only a forest, only a whisper. But I know better now. The forest speaks, and it remembers. Even as the sun rose fully, spilling golden light over the pines, I didn't feel relief. The forest was quiet now, almost benign in appearance, but I knew better. The shadows lingered in my mind, tucked behind eyelids, behind every creak of the camper, every rustle of leaves. Emma tried to smile, tried to shake off the terror, but I could see it in her eyes. We had both crossed a threshold that night, glimpsed something beyond reason, and there was no unseeing it. Packing up that morning felt surreal. Every motion, the latch of the camper door, the folding of chairs, the gentle rumble of the VW engine was weighted with the memory of what had happened. I found myself scanning the edges of the forest compulsively, half expecting the shadows to reach out, half expecting the whispers to return. And in that unease, I realized a truth I couldn't ignore. The fear wasn't just in the forest. It was inside me, threaded into every memory of that night, lingering in the quiet moments when I thought I was alone. Driving away from Whispering Pines, the trees thinning into the flat roads of northern Michigan, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shape moving among the receding pines. I didn't see anything. I wanted to believe that meant it was over. But I didn't trust that. I never would again. Over the weeks and months that followed, I found myself reflecting on that night constantly. What had drawn us there? Was it the lure of solitude, the thrill of exploring the unknown, or something deeper, an instinct I had ignored, warning me that the road sometimes leads to more than adventure? I realized that the forest had offered me a lesson disguised as terror. Respect what you cannot see. Listen to what you cannot hear. Trust the whispers of caution, even when your rational mind tells you it's nonsense. I've since returned to RV camping many times, but never the same way. I check every site meticulously. I observe the land with a new humility. I honor the silence between the trees, the spaces where the wind might carry more than just leaves. And though I tell myself I am braver now, wiser now, I carry with me the memory of those whispers, not as a horror story to share lightly, but as a reminder. Fear, real fear, is a teacher. It sharpens your senses, forces your awareness, and sometimes it saves your life. Emma and I never spoke much about the specifics of that night. Some things are too personal, too close to the edge to put into words, but occasionally when the wind is right and the night stretches long, I swear I hear it again. Soft, insistent, carrying just beyond the boundary of sleep. And I smile in a strange, anxious way because I understand now. The forest remembers, and so do I. Freedom on the road comes with its shadows, adventure comes with its costs, and sometimes the lessons are whispered in the dark, in the spaces where the trees watch and wait. But surviving, truly surviving, is about more than escaping the night. It's about listening, respecting, and carrying the experience forward, even when it chills you to the bone. Every time I hitch up the Volkswagen and slide onto a lonely back road, every time I pass a stretch of forest as deep and quiet as Whispering Pines, I carry that night with me, not as fear alone, but as a compass guiding me through the unknown. And I know, beyond doubt, that somewhere out there the whispers wait, always patient, always watching, and I am ready, finally, to hear them. I never imagined a place as empty as the Bisty Badlands could feel so alive. My name is Marcus. I'm 40, and I've spent more nights in an RV than in any real home over the past decade. I've chased sunsets across New Mexico, camped in forgotten forest corners, and slept under stars so bright I swore they were watching me back. But that March evening, the desert whispered differently. That night, the wind carried something I could not name, something that pressed against the skin of my mind as much as the chill of the early spring air pressed against my body. I had arrived at Bisty just after sunset. The Badlands themselves are a labyrinth of eroded rock, bleached spires, and alien formations, lit in the dying sun's crimson glow like a sculpture park abandoned by reason. I parked my aging Volkswagen van, my home on wheels, on a flat patch of sand that seemed to defy the chaotic curves of the landscape. The engine died with a soft shudder, and the world fell silent, except for the low sighing of the wind across cracked stones. It was quiet at first, almost soothing, a lullaby of the desert. I took a long breath, watching shadows stretch impossibly long across the ground, stretching toward me like dark fingers. I set up my small camping stove and heated water for tea, trying to ignore the way the air seemed to thrum with anticipation. The silence wasn't natural. It had a rhythm, a cadence. The desert itself was inhaling, waiting. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination. I always told myself that. By 9, darkness had swallowed the Badlands whole. The stars above were brilliant, cold, distant, and yet I felt their gaze pressing down, urging me to notice something I didn't understand. I finished my tea and leaned back against the van, listening. And that's when I heard it, the faintest crunch of sand somewhere behind me. I froze. My heartbeat thudded painfully in my chest. My first thought was another camper, perhaps wandering these remote formations. But this area is isolated, unpatrolled. No one comes here unless they are seeking something or running from it. I stepped outside the van, flashlight in hand, and scanned the shifting outlines of the Badlands. The wind had calmed, but in the silence, I could hear every minute sound, the scratching of rocks, the sigh of stones settling, the distant cry of a coyote. And then I saw them, footprints in the soft sand, fresh and impossible. They were humanoid, yes, but uneven, almost too long, their toes splayed like claws. And they were heading straight toward me. Yet no figure followed. The prints began 20 feet from the van and ended at my wheels, as though someone or something had been invisible the entire time. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. My hands trembled, gripping the flashlight so tightly the metal cut into my palm. Must be animals, maybe a coyote on 2 legs, or maybe it's a trick of the sand, I muttered to myself. But deep down, I knew better. My instincts have never been wrong, not in all the years I've spent alone on the road. Something unnatural had arrived, something patient, something that didn't want to be seen, but wanted to be known. I retreated inside the van, locking the doors, trying to rationalize the impossible. I stared at the dashboard, at the keys, at the empty desert beyond the glass. My mind raced with every story I had ever heard of the Badlands, disappearances, strange lights, travelers who vanished only to reappear days later, claiming they had been watched. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, but the hairs on my neck rose, each nerve alert to a presence I could not see. The footprints pressed in my memory like a living thing, etched in the back of my mind with a cold precision. Hours passed. I tried to sleep. The van creaked with every movement, the small furnace rattled, and outside, the wind picked up again. But then the sound returned, the crunch of sand, closer this time, circling the van. I pressed myself against the passenger seat, straining to hear. The air outside felt thicker, almost viscous, each sound amplified. Then I caught it, a faint shadow shifting behind a distant spire, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. My stomach turned over, bile rising. I didn't know if I should run or stay still. Curiosity won over fear for a heartbeat. I cracked the window just enough to peer out. The moonlight painted the rocks in silver, but there was no human, no animal, nothing. And yet, when I looked down at the sand, new footprints had appeared, encircling the van, pointing inward like arrows marking a boundary. They were perfectly spaced, deliberate. Whoever or whatever made them was intelligent, aware. My rational mind screamed at me to drive away, to flee into the darkness, but my body was frozen. I felt like an intruder in someone else's world, caught in a trap laid with infinite patience. The night stretched onward. The wind's sighs became whispers in my ears, forming syllables I could almost understand, almost, but never quite. And then I saw the lights, small, flickering glows far across the dunes, moving slowly in no pattern I could comprehend. I tried to follow them with my eyes, but they danced just beyond clarity, vanishing whenever I focused. Panic set in. My fingers were numb, teeth clenched, and every instinct screamed, "Do not go out." And yet, I did. I can't explain why. Some part of me needed to see, to confront what was haunting me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the cold night. Sand crunched under my boots, my breath puffing in visible clouds. The temperature had dropped sharply. The desert's chill was biting, unnatural. I followed the glow, moving between spires and hoodoos that seemed to lean toward me, pressing their silent weight. Every sound was amplified. The snap of a branch, the hiss of wind, the soft padding behind me that wasn't sand. Not quite. The footprints led me to a wide hollow, a natural amphitheater of stone. The lights were gone, but the air here hummed. The sand was covered in prints, hundreds of them, but none belonged to anything human. They were too deep, too precise, their orientation impossible. They radiated from a single point, like a message written in a language my mind had forgotten. And standing in the center of it all, I saw it. A figure, taller than a man, limbs too long, features blurred as if it was moving too fast for the eye to catch. Its head tilted toward me, unnervingly calm. I could not see its face, yet I felt its gaze pierce me, burrowing into my skull, laying bare every secret I had tried to hide from myself. I stumbled back, heart hammering, the flashlight slipping from my fingers. It didn't move, but I knew it was following, each of its steps echoing in my chest. I ran blindly toward the van, sand flying, arms flailing, the desert now a labyrinth of shadows and illusions. Behind me, the crunch of footsteps accelerated, echoing as if from all directions at once. I slammed the door, locked it, and pressed myself against the dashboard, shaking, sobbing, utterly unprepared for what I had encountered. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight clutched like a talisman, listening to the shifting shadows and whispers. Every now and then I thought I heard something brushing against the van, small taps on metal that faded before I could react. And yet, with the first light of dawn, the desert returned to silence. The footprints were gone, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. No evidence, no trace, just the memory burned into my mind, and the fear that this was not the last time I would be watched. I packed up quickly, refusing to linger, and drove out of the Badlands. Every mile on the dusty highway, I replayed the night in my head. The image of that figure burned into my vision, the echo of invisible footsteps haunting every curve of the road. I told myself it was a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion, but rationalizations felt hollow. My instincts, honed over years of solitary travel, screamed otherwise. Something had been there. Something still is. Something waits for the next camper brave or foolish enough to wander into its desert. I have returned to Bisty Badlands since then, once, twice, always during daylight, always with company. But I never stay after sunset. The wind carries the same cadence, the same unspoken anticipation. I avoid the flat sand where I parked my van, the hollow where I saw it. And yet at night, in my dreams, I feel the crunch of sand beneath invisible feet. I hear the whispers of something ancient, intelligent, patient, waiting just beyond the edge of perception. And I know with a certainty I cannot deny that one day I will hear those steps again. The desert is alive. It watches, and it never forgets. I never believed in that unsettling pause you sometimes hear in nature, the kind that wraps around you like a damp cloak pressing into your chest, whispering that something is off. My name is Ethan Callahan. I'm 42, and I've been traveling across the United States in my Volkswagen camper for over a decade. I've camped in deserts that felt like they might swallow me whole, forests so thick you couldn't see the sun at noon, and mountaintops that seemed to hum with secrets older than any of us. But nothing prepared me for what I felt at Tallulah Gorge Overlook in Georgia back in April of 2023. I pulled my VW camper into the small clearing just past the main overlook around mid-afternoon. The air was still crisp from early spring, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine sap. Birds called from the canopy, squirrels darted across mossy branches, and somewhere nearby, water spilled over rocks, cascading down the gorge in a silver thread. It should have been serene, beautiful, the kind of place you drive for miles just to inhale. I told myself I was here to relax, to take a day off the road, to watch the world without moving. By the time I had set up my small stove and kettle, the sun was beginning to bend low, brushing the gorge with amber light. I had just taken my first sip of coffee when I noticed it, the sudden absence of sound. The birds stopped mid-song, Squirrels froze in the open, and the water, though still moving, seemed muffled. I blinked, thinking I'd imagined it, or that my senses were playing tricks. But then the rustling from the underbrush ceased entirely. Even the wind, which had been teasing the treetops, fell away into a haunting stillness. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps a predator had passed through, a hawk, a fox, something that made every creature hush. Maybe this was normal, a fleeting phenomenon in the forest. My heart, though, disagreed with my logic. There was a pressure in the air, something almost tangible, like the forest itself was holding its breath, and I was intruding on a moment it had never intended me to witness. The feeling grew heavy as shadows lengthened. I walked closer to the edge of the overlook, gripping the railing of the old wooden platform, and that's when I noticed the footprints. Deep, wide, indented in the soft soil, leading away from the main path and disappearing into the thick woods. Not deer, not bear, something else. My stomach tightened. I've seen tracks before in Yellowstone, in the Smokies, even in the deserts of Arizona. I could usually identify them, but these were wrong. Each step was deliberate, calculated, and the spacing was too wide, too human, but wrong at the same time. I thought about leaving. I thought about jumping back into my VW, revving the engine, and driving until the silence broke, until civilization swallowed me up again. But curiosity, that dangerous companion, held me fast. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the tracks into the forest, each step crunching softly over fallen leaves. My pulse was loud in my ears, pounding with every cautious step, every hesitant footfall. The silence pressed against me as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. I walked deeper than I intended, further than any map suggested I should. The smell of wet soil thickened, and then, just as my anxiety peaked, I noticed it. A faint, acrid scent, like burnt sugar or old rust. It clung to the undergrowth, curling around my senses, twisting the familiar into something foreign. That's when I realized my flashlight beam was cutting through something in the air, tiny motes dancing like a constellation of stars. But they weren't stars. They were almost alive, moving with a purpose. My skin prickled as the hairs on my neck rose. Then I heard it. Not the usual creak of branches or rustle of leaves, but a low, rolling growl from somewhere beyond the trees. It was distant, yet it seemed to vibrate through the very ground I stood on. My rational mind screamed, "Animal!" But something deeper, something instinctual, told me that this wasn't just any animal. It was deliberate, observant, and it knew I was here. I froze. I had the flashlight trained in the direction of the sound, but my eyes refused to focus. Every tree seemed warped, elongated, stretching unnaturally, casting shadows that didn't align with the fading light. My pulse raced, and yet my legs felt leaden. The forest had shifted from friend to antagonist, a living organism that could suffocate you without moving a single limb. I told myself I was imagining it. I was tired. I was alone. I needed to leave. Then the silence returned, abrupt, complete, and it was worse than the growl, because now there was no question I was entirely, utterly alone. The tracks had stopped, no wind, no bird, no rustle, only my own breathing and the soft, almost imperceptible whisper of movement just beyond the trees. I could feel the presence of whatever had passed this way, lingering, watching. My mind churned between panic and reason. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it clearly, and yet I knew it was there. I turned to go, finally deciding that survival outweighed curiosity, and my flashlight caught something, a figure. Not fully formed, not entirely human, but a shadow at the edge of perception. It moved with intent, gliding, never breaking the silhouette of the trees, blending with the darkness in a way that felt unnatural. My stomach lurched, my hands trembled, and I realized my mind had been trying to rationalize the irrational. I ran. Not carefully, not cautiously. I ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly, illuminating twisted roots and my own terror-stricken face in brief, fragmented flashes. Branches tore at my jacket, roots tripped my feet, and the forest seemed to mock my frantic escape, stretching the distance to the clearing impossibly long. I could feel it following, just out of reach, a presence that pressed on my back, though no one touched me. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare stop. When I finally burst into the clearing, gasping, shoving the VW door open and collapsing inside, the forest seemed to exhale behind me. The sounds of wildlife timidly returned, a bird's chirp, the distant babble of water, the whispering wind, but it was different now, altered. I didn't feel relief. I felt marked. The forest had imprinted something on me that I couldn't shake, a reminder that some spaces, some silences carry weight far heavier than fear itself. That night, I sat in the VW, engine idling, lights casting long shadows across the clearing, and I thought about how the mind fills gaps in perception with dread, and yet sometimes what you fear is real. Not always in a physical sense, not always tangible, but as a presence, a tension, a knowledge that the world is far stranger than our routines let us admit. I learned, as I drove away the next morning, to listen to the forest differently, to respect its silences, to acknowledge that some truths are held in shadow, some horrors only whispered in the spaces between sound. Since that night at Tallulah Gorge, I carry the silence with me. Not like a scar, not like a memory easily recalled, but like a pulse beneath my own, a reminder that the wilderness is alive in ways most people never notice, that some spaces remember us even when we forget them, that some forests, when they fall quiet, are not asleep. They are watching, waiting, and teaching. I don't tell this story to frighten. I tell it so you understand. RV camping is not just a retreat. It is an encounter. And sometimes the encounter is with the parts of the world and of ourselves that we cannot tame, cannot name, and cannot escape. The forest will speak, sometimes with birdsong, sometimes with wind through the pines, and sometimes it will go completely terrifyingly quiet. When that happens, you will know it is not emptiness. It is attention, and what it notices, it never forgets.